Ake Willow, Season 5, Chapter 6, Bullied. I remember, as a child, being bullied a lot. For the longest time, I thought I was unique in that way, and that somehow the world was divided between the bullies and the bullied, that there were predators and there were prey, and by some terrible roll of the dice, I was born the latter. In time, I learned that things were more complicated. I've never grown to completely forgive my bullies. While sitcoms and after-school specials did their best to teach me that sometimes kids were mean because things were bad at home, I never bought that explanation. Even when I was still wearing Velcro shoes, it all sounded like a weak excuse. What I did eventually assimilate, to some extent, is that a kid might be a bully one year and a victim the next. Or that what became a life-altering event for me was little more than a forgettable anecdote to them. What I'm getting at is how asymmetrical these experiences can be. The same could be said about my relationship with Eric. In some ways, he too was my bully. He'd steal my dolls and make fun of the way I dressed. If we were at the local playground together, he'd fart and say it was me. Once, he took the chain off my bike so I couldn't follow him and his friends to the park. It's a never-ending list of small crimes and petty taunts that cast him as the undeniable villain of my home life. On the flip side, when we were at school, he was my knight in shining armor. Sure, Eric didn't come into his muscular beefcake physique until a few years ago, but he's always been big, and he is 2 years my senior. That might not seem like much, but it made a big difference, even in high school. Whenever he was around, the bullies would keep their distance. No one dared speak a wrong word that might summon the wrath of the big blonde kid. Even though he had his own problems to deal with, Eric would always find time to bring down the hammer on anyone wishing me harm. No matter how much of an asshole he was at home, I knew that as long as he was there, my big brother would never let any harm come to me. It took someone outside of our school's ecosystem to break through that protection. Not a bully, not someone from school. We were going to the convenience store one evening. I suppose it must have been on a Friday, since we'd both just received our allowance. We're going to get some snacks and rent a couple of movies on the way back. Eric walked while I was trying to learn to skateboard. I think I was 13 or 14 at the time, and I absolutely sucked at keeping my balance on wheels. But I was determined, and somehow Eric was patient. The board was a wonderfully girly thing with bright yellow wheels and a pink anime-looking piece of art printed on top. I'd saved up for it with my own money, though I think Mom might have helped too. The dream was to be able to go to the skate park near the Olympic Stadium. And maybe I would have done it. Maybe by leveraging my pig-headedness, I could have learned to balance myself and perhaps even do a few tricks. Raw talent was lacking, but I remember enjoying the challenge and quietly cheering myself on with every inch of improvement. Except, on that night, I lost my skateboard. Some kid, I only call him a kid now because I realize he couldn't have been older than 16, started taunting me about my board and how I kept falling off of it. We could have just walked away. We should have just walked away, but I had Eric with me and I felt invincible. And Eric, well, once I started talking back, it became a matter of pride to defend his little sister. It must have been someone who knew Eric. Maybe one of the first kids to taunt him for his lack of interest in girls and curious glances towards boys. Whatever the case, they were looking for a reason to get in a fight. They wanted to create a situation where they could beat my brother up. And beat him up they did. That kid trampled my brother's ass. Eric was big, but he wasn't athletic. All it took was someone a little older, about the same size, and in slightly better shape to kick my brother to the curb. And take my pink skateboard. That's what I think of when I look at Darling. I think of Eric on the day he couldn't defend me. How bloody and bruised, insulted and humiliated, all he could think of was how he failed to stop my skateboard being stolen by a bigger kid. Like Darling, he didn't quite know what to do with himself or where to project his fury and anger. He didn't have a leash to pull on, but I remember our father stopping Eric from breaking his fist on a wall. Darling isn't Dragon's big sister, but she was his bodyguard, companion, and partner. The two were inseparable, and it's difficult to imagine what force was capable of taking one without feeling the wrath of the other. "Mr. Pickering?" I venture to ask. "Do you know what happened?" It's such a stupid question. Pickering stands up from his crouch. If there's a chromosome that marks a person as a farmer, Richard Pickering has it twice. He looks like the kind of man who has half a dozen eggs and a steak for breakfast, all of it consumed before dawn. Where I swear and growl every morning before I make it to my ovens, he must bear the early hours with the sort of stoic determination only those raised on physical labor and harsh discipline can. In a fight between him and a moose, I'd put my money on the moose, but I'd hesitate first. "Girl," he says, towering over me, "if I knew who stole my dragon, I'd be unlocking my gun cabinet right now." He's close enough that his belly pushes on my box of pastries. Pickering's musculature isn't showroom quality like Eric's. His are not the peacock feathers of my brother. There's no sculptor's tool involved, and no attention has been given to defining the muscles. Every part of Pickering's limbs are padded with a layer of fat, and thick hair covers his arms and neck. This close proximity of his, and the volume of his voice, makes me teeter between fight and flight. Like that moment when a baker hesitates over pulling a soufflé from the oven, unsure whether it's best to act or wait. I weather the storm, hoping that I'll get my chance when it calms down. But that is not Eric's policy. "Come on," he says, somehow slipping between me and the farmer. "Back off, man." Annabelle's eyes grow wide, which does nothing to comfort me. I'm new to Aquillow, and Eric is a complete stranger to town, but Annabelle? She was born and raised here. As the mayor's daughter, she knows everyone, and everyone knows her, at least a little. For the last few years, every fall, she's been hanging out in the woods behind the Pickering farm with her friends. If she's afraid of how Richard Pickering will react to Eric's challenge, then I'm terrified. And didn't he mention something about guns? "All right," the farmer says, controlled threat in his voice. "Get off my property. Get off my property before I break off your arm and feed it to Darling. Clear?" Darling growls and barks, as if she understood and agreed with the threat. "And you," he points a thick finger at Annabelle. "Tell your mother to expect a phone call. I've had enough of you and your friends trespassing on my land like you own the place." I don't remember Mr. Pickering being quite that aggressive. Then again, one of his dogs has gone missing, and as a man who has no other company than Darling and Dragon, I understand him seeing red. "Mr. Pickering," I try to intervene, but this is now a matter of pride for Eric, and when has pride ever led to anything good? Before Richard Pickering even has the chance of considering my words, my brother does the unthinkable. He slaps away the farmer's finger that pointed at Annabelle. "You can't threaten us," Eric says, bracing himself for retaliation. "Oh yes, I think. Mr. Pickering can certainly threaten us. In fact, I've felt threatened since the moment he stood up. I want to tell Eric as much, but there's no time. I've seen violence since moving to Aquillow. Gruesome acts of supernatural brutality have left me scarred in body and soul. I still occasionally wake from nightmares, sweaty and screaming, as I relive through slumber the savage events I've witnessed. Almost unanimously, however, these moments of savagery were committed not by mortal hands. To see a man the size of a bear, 3 times my age, lay into one of my own isn't an experience I was ready for, especially not with my own brother as target. Pickering wastes no time posturing or intimidating. That is not his way. Instead, with one swift step forward, he buries his fist deep into Eric's abdomen. Half the farmer's arm seems to vanish into my brother's stomach as he doubles over, as much from the impact as the pain. There's no attempt to block and no chance to retaliate. It's a struggle for Eric to breathe, let alone remain upright. By the time Pickering steps back, fists like a battering ram, ready to strike again, my big brother has crumpled to the floor like a house of cards toppling over. Threatened yet? Of course we are. The three of us came here looking for help. Never for an instant did we think this would escalate to violence. The gasps and moans of Eric tell me of his pain, but also that he's breathing. In Pickering's faltering menace, I hear regret. It's in his voice and in the shaking of his fists, but it isn't in his actions. Through Darling's barks and the bellowed threats, I hear only chaos and escalation. The man has no intention of standing down. Eric coughs behind me as I step to stand between the two men. There's no way to know what will happen next or if it's safe for us to remain here a moment longer. Pickering could very easily make a beeline to his home and crack open that aforementioned gun safe. Or perhaps he'll try to emphasize his point by taking me down as well. All of these possible scenarios lay themselves out before me as I crouch to the ground. My movements are a crawl, yet I feel even slower, perceived through the molasses of high alertness. I could stop to count the drops of spittle sprayed from Darling's mouth as she barks, so slow has time become. My right knee rests on gravel, shooting pain up my leg, but I dare not wince. Instead, I lay down the cardboard box in my hands, putting it on the ground to flip the lid open. Some are crushed, others a little dented. Some are glistening with butter glaze, while others are the deep, finely textured brown of chocolate. There are 12 of them, beautifully baked pastries looking up from that box. Crumbs of firm, moist sponge break off a peanut butter blondie as I pick it up between shaking fingers. The weight of 8 eyes press upon me, but none are heavier than my own self-scrutiny. What am I doing? I look up, flick my wrist, and hope for the best. The peace offering arcs through the air, observed by all eyes on the scene. Pickering flinches as it sails a foot over his shoulder, disappearing behind him. While Darling does hesitate for a second, unsure if she should keep wallowing in her anger or take a break to nab a snack for a second. The blondie doesn't even make it to the ground. Darling annihilates the pastry, large gobs of saliva dripping to the dirt floor in the process. Done in the blink of an eye, her focus is shifted. Her keen nose picks up on my box of treasures. I drop my ass on the ground and pick up the box again to keep in my lap. Taking a brownie for myself, I observe Darling as she questions her loyalties. Her leash won't let her reach this close, but I can toss her more food, and she knows it. As long as I keep her out of the chocolates, I think I may have won her over. Pickering looks down, the full realization of what he's done crashing down on his shoulders. Knees a little weak and shoulders slumped, the rage drops out of him as fast as it did his dog. A flash of anger, self-directed, does cross his features as he swears to himself. He steps over me, never even giving me the courtesy of a glance. Instead, he extends a hand over to Eric. "Sorry, kid," Pickering says, the tone firm but with a sheepishness to his inflection. Eric coughs once more before taking the farmer's hand and accepting help to his feet. "That's a hell of a punch," he wheezes. "Good thing you didn't go for the face." I bite my brownie, then toss a croissant over to Darling. Watching the dog about to devour it, I realize just how much, like the croissant, I'm just a moment away from crumbling to pieces. In the end, it took less time for Eric to recover from his guts getting smashed into sausage than it took me to recuperate from the whole scene. Credit where it's due. Once he realized the scale of his mistake, Richard Pickering was quick to take charge and make amends. First, to notice my distress, he took Eric back to the farmhouse to fetch water. Annabelle remained by my side, comforting me by complimenting my baked goods, which, of course, necessitated the consumption of at least 2 samples. I don't know what it is that my brother and the farmer talked about while they were away, but they both came back laughing. I won't pretend the fear of something far more nefarious didn't cross my mind in their absence, but I didn't expect cheer and good humor either. "Here," Pickering says, kneeling to offer me a bottle of water. Without asking, he takes a Blondie, gets up, and walks back to Darling. The dog's joy was short-lived. There were only so many treats I could give her, and free food could only do so much to distract her from her partner's disappearance. The air was no longer filled with Darling's angry barks or cries of confusion. Instead, she paced the length of her leash, sniffing at the ground and the clouds. She'd give me a forlorn glance once in a while, but only in the hopes of another croissant. "You okay?" I ask Eric as he helps me up to my feet. "I wouldn't pick him as a sparring partner, but I'll be okay. You?" How am I? I feel like I've been on the same terrifying roller coaster over 100 times, never getting so much as a minute between each ride. My blood is adrenaline and my pupils will not contract. I still tremble from being on high alert, like water that will not stop boiling. "I've seen worse," I say, steadying myself on his arm. But he's calling me out. There's more, and he knows it. Annabelle knows it too. Hell, I bet Darling sees it. But now is not the time. I crack the seal of the plastic bottle, removing the cap to take a long swig of ice-cold water. When was the last time I had water that hadn't gone through a filter and some coffee grounds first? Or water that didn't infuse leaves and flowers to extract their flavor? My nerves settle with every swallow, never going back to an acceptable baseline, but a notable improvement nonetheless. There's a metal click and a low growl, followed by a sharp bark. Pickering has unleashed Darling, literally, but she's now equipped with a nylon muzzle, a reminder that she's an aggressive animal and perhaps one that will eat just about any random thing she finds. "Daylight's burning," Pickering calls out, slinging a bag over his shoulder. What would be a reasonable school bag to Annabelle looks like a dainty purse on him. "What? You want to help find out what happened to people's pets? Well, I want to find my dog, before it's too late." Pickering doesn't wait. 2 quick, open palm taps of his hand on his thigh, and Darling trots to his side. Then he's gone, briskly walking towards the forest's edge. He's right, though. While days are getting longer with every passing week, the afternoon has bled away without our notice. It's not yet evening or even twilight, but the sun is starting to hang low on the horizon, and it gets dark so much earlier in the forest. "So," I ask, catching up with Pickering, "what did happen to Dragon?" I offer up my box of pastries, now down to a measly 4 specimens, most of which were crushed by the farmer's earlier posturing. He takes one from the open box, a brownie, and chews on it thoughtfully. "Ask her," he says, nodding his chin towards Darling. "She's the only one who was there." I watch the immense dog running ahead, sniffing at the air, bending over to smell the base of trees, and attempting to chew on random ferns and leaves. The only other animal in Aquilo that I know to rival Darling in size is Julia Remington's Great Dane, Oswald. No sensible human being would dare approach either of these 2 beasts, least of all Darling, who, despite being a little smaller, is far more aggressive. "How good of a tracker is she?" "She's a good girl," he chuckles. "But she couldn't find bread in a bread box, bless her soul." "What's the point, then?" Annabelle pipes up from behind, still rattled by the sound of her voice. We're getting deep into the forest, and the shadows are stretching so long as to paint over the underbrush completely. During winter, this forest is easy to navigate, even by moonlight, but today, should the sun set completely, I'm not sure I could make it out before morning. I know someone who got lost in these woods before, and they did not enjoy the experience. "I'm banking on Darling putting a more valiant effort with her buddy on the line," Pickering explains. The dog does indeed look hard at work, and a casual glance would suggest that she is on something's trail. though she could also be leading us in a random direction or walking us in circles. "She's got a good nose," the farmer continues, "but she lacks training and discipline for tracking. Besides, why would I ever use Darling when I have Dragon?" "Except if you ever needed to find Dragon," Annabelle suggests. "How do you find a buried metal detector?" Eric asks farther back to bring the point home. Pickering laughs it off, appreciating, if not enjoying, the irony of the situation. At least he's tolerant of Annabelle's ribbing and cooperating in the search. That's a lot of progress from nearly punching through my brother's spine. This could very well be a brisk walk in the woods. Much like our journey to the Pickering farm, it has all the hallmarks of a hike. All except for the mission we've set ourselves upon and the nature of the forest we're in. Tension runs higher the lower our visibility gets. Like drops of water falling into a glass filled to the brim, minutes pass, pushing us further to the point where it will all spill over. Colors get washed out into gray-purple slurry. Like meats and veggies in a chili, they lose their individuality, eventually becoming uniform. Shadows blur, swallowing all sense of distance and shape. It's like walking through a painting, the world having lost its third dimension. And then none of us, apart from Darling, are able to pinpoint the origin of the sound. There have been so many branches falling and animals scampering through the underbrush that the sound should have become familiar background noise by now, like the clinking of spoons in mugs or the chewing of food at the cafe. This snap, however, was too loud and too close. Its echo played between the trunks of the large trees, refusing to be swallowed by the needles and branches of the evergreen. I want to ignore it, to act like it's just one of the many other sounds we've ignored so far. But Darling's ears perk up and her neck snaps to attention, pointing somewhere to our left. We all turn to look, hoping or fearing to see what she sees. While we try to pierce through the penumbra, failing to make sense of the vanishing shapes of the forest, she bolts in the complete opposite direction. "Darling!" Pickering yells, taking off after his dog. Within a moment, he's gone, leaving only his fading footsteps behind. Eric hesitates for a moment, his head swiveling back and forth between Pickering's last location and where Annabelle and I stand, dumbstruck. "Stay here," he says, waving a hand in our direction. "I'll go get him." "Eric, no!" I try to call him back, not wanting us to get separated any further. I'm not useless in a forest. At least, I don't think I am. I've braved scary trees at night many times in Aquilo, but Eric is big and strong, and with Annabelle, who knows these woods fairly well, I felt a little safer with all of us together. I know he heard me. He turns to look back and gives me a thumbs up as he jogs between trees. But of course, Eric doesn't listen. In his mind, I assume, he thinks he'll be back with the farmer and dog in a moment. Maybe they'll even have both dogs, the disappearance of Dragon solved once and for all. Anywhere else, I might have given him the benefit of the doubt, but not in Aquilo. Not in these woods. "I guess we wait," Annabelle says, plunging her hands into the pockets of her cargo pants and leaning against a birch. "You look resigned," I say, picking out a croissant from the box and offering Annabelle her choice of either of the remaining treats. She goes for the brownie. "Well," she starts through a mouthful of chocolate, "something spooked Darling over there, so she's just running. We won't catch up to her and the boys, and I don't want to get lost trying. Whatever can scare that dog away, though, I don't want to face alone. Best plan, I think, is to just wait until they sort themselves out before we do anything." Annabelle raises her brownie like she's giving a toast before taking another voracious bite. She's not wrong, of course. Between Darling, Pickering, and my brother, we've lost all the heavy hitters in our little group. Not that they would be of any help if we run into a bear, or worse, but it was nice to have them around for safety. I take a few steps in the direction of where the snap originated, careful to keep Annabelle in view. Munching, absent-minded, on my croissant, I try to peer between the trees and perhaps catch a glimpse of whatever made that noise. Wouldn't it be hilarious if it turned out to be a deer or moose? Not that running into a moose in the forest isn't a terrifying notion. Most people don't realize just how big one of those animals can really be. But I'd rather that than some of the more terrifying things I've seen in Aquilow's forest. Everything looks familiar and strange at the same time, I mutter.
I know, right? For the last 10 minutes, I thought we were going to walk straight into the Donsolites clearing. I guess a tree is a tree is a tree.
Her voice is a little faint, and I wonder if I might have gone a little too far, yet I take another couple of steps. I swear, though, I've been here before. I'm just about to walk down a shallow ditch where a few stones are gathering moss under a thin layer of ferns when I hear another snapping of wood. Closer.
Annabelle?
I hiss through my teeth.
I hear it.
Again, a crack, getting closer. I walk back some, trying to move toward Annabelle without turning away from the source of the sound. Whatever's there, if there is anything, it escapes my eyes. But I can smell it. Annabelle, I say, struggling to stay balanced as I climb back up to her. We can't stay here.
But the boys.
We gotta go. More than any choice of words I could have conjured, the tone of my voice is sufficient to spur her to action. The half-crushed box of pastries, along with its sole occupant, fly from my hands, spinning in the direction of the noises. My sneakers dig and slip, tossing soil and rotting branches behind. We don't quite run. Running through these woods, dodging through tightly packed trees, is borderline impossible and a good way to trip and fall. Rather, it's a brisk, careful jog that takes us deeper into the woods. The light is all but gone out of the forest, though a quick look above still shows specks of pale orange sky between the thick foliage. It's already night here, while the evening stretches on out with the rest of the world. I still smell it. Tucked between the aroma of burgeoning leaves and the fragrance of last season's decay, the smell of rotting meat singed at the edges can be found. I wonder if Annabelle can spot it too, or if it's just something I'm more attuned with.
What is it?
Annabelle asks, insistent.
What is it?
I clench fingers around her wrist and stop her. How long have we been fleeing before she asked the question? 5 minutes? 10? We weren't sprinting, and yet I find myself out of breath. I'm not sure. Do you know where we are? She draws closer, putting a hand over mine. Her eyes seem to be picking up the fading light more than usual, or is that just the glint of tears I see? Her skin is textured in goosebumps, and her fingers have a shiver born of either cold or terror. I think, she mumbles, her head on a swivel, looking this way and that.
I think the clearing should be a few 100 yards that way. Yes, the forest only gets this dense north of the dances, and we only see this many birches in the patch a few minutes' walk from there. Unless there's another bunch of birches, or... I'm sure you're right, I reassure, trying to keep her from spiraling further. Come on, let's get a move on. If we can make it to the clearing, we can make it out of the forest.
The night keeps chewing, swallowing ever larger bites of the day. Every minute I think the light couldn't get any more scarce, the forest finds a way to get darker. Tripping and stumbling, it becomes impossible to know that we're going in a straight line. Birches, maples, oaks, and sycamore become indistinguishable from one another, all boil down to their simplest definition in the dark. Trees are all we see, with some having needles and some leaves, but none with enough personality to offer directions.
Don't tell anyone, Miriam, but right now, I really miss my mom.
We're going to be fine, I lie. Even if we just walk all night, when the sun comes up, we'll find our way home. Remember when Thomas got lost? He wasn't even that far into the forest when we found him. She nods, I think, but the way her fingers now dig into my arm, Annabelle may not have my sense of taste and smell, but she's a far better listener. I doubt my words were enough to fool her with such a naked lie. What lie? That we'll be found? That we're safe? Truth is, I can't promise either of these things. The smell is back. I'm not even sure it ever completely left us. Unable to catch up, it did keep up, following in our wake, tracking us either by scent or sound or some other preternatural means. I can't even pinpoint where it's coming from anymore. It seems to have surrounded us, permeating the whole area. We might as well be standing in the middle of an abattoir, our shoes soiled with drying offals and the floor around us slick with coagulated blood. Organs and muscles, all laid bare, fill the air with their stench.
That smell.
Annabelle notices it too. Another crack of a branch and the shuffling of leaves in the undergrowth break the otherwise perfect silence. Not an owl or a cricket has made a noise since we stopped, and the whole forest holds its breath as we wait to meet our fate. As I hear my heart beating ever harder in my chest, setting my ribs to vibrate with every thump, something crawls out of the shadows. Barely visible in the absent light, it looks like the shadow of a dog. I fear, for the flash of an instant, that we found Dragon, or that he found us. But this is not Richard Pickering's beloved hound any longer. This animal has the build of a pit bull and would be twice the size of Dragon. It has no fur, but instead crawls around with muscles exposed like a lab specimen. It exudes unnatural heat, and there's an infernal glow, like burning coals, seething deep at the back of its eye sockets. When it growls, massive, sharp teeth, like steak knives, protrude from its jaw. I've met one of these things before. It tried to kill me, not out of hunger or out of fear, but out of blind, unconscious hatred. I gave it a name back then. Hellhound. Aquilo is written by J.F. Dubow and narrated and produced by me, Amy Frost. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform. Want to support the show? Buy us a coffee. Go to ko-fi.com/Aquilo to donate. Aquilo has a Patreon. Visit patreon.com/Aquilo for details. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram under the username Aquilo.